Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute precision.
Right, it's very binary.
Exactly. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the film, and the doctor just points to it and says, there it is, that is the problem. It's broken or not broken. It's a clean, visible categorization.
And we rely on that kind of clarity. I mean, it gives us a framework to solve problems.
But then you step into the world of historical identity and territorial claims in the Caucasus, and suddenly that x-ray machine is completely broken.
Completely.
We are looking at a historical landscape that is incredibly murky. So today, we are taking a detailed exploration within our Caucasian history series, focusing heavily on a deep dive into the history of the Abkhazians.
It is a dense topic.
It is. We are looking at the ethnogenesis of the Abkhazians, their internal cultural and moral codes, and how they navigated a reality of being constantly caught between the Byzantine, Ottoman, Russian, and Soviet empires.
Which is a lot of pressure over centuries.
Right. All of these layers stack on top of one another to create the intense political crises we see in the modern day. And this is where history stops being a simple timeline, and becomes something else entirely.
Because depending on whose archives you are looking at, Georgian or Abkhazian, you often get completely irreconcilable realities.
I mean, that is the defining characteristic of this specific history. The texts we're examining contain fundamentally conflicting historical narratives.
Yes. We are looking at highly contested accounts of politically charged conflicts.
So we have to be clear to you, the listener, we are not taking sides here.
Absolutely not. The only way to navigate this is to examine these viewpoints precisely as they exist in the original material.
We're simply conveying the ideas contained in the sources. We are looking at the architecture of these historical claims impartially.
And to understand the modern geopolitical situation in Abkhazia, we really have to start at the physical root.
Right. So we are tracing the origins of the Abkhazian people back to the 3rd millennium BCE along the shores of the Black Sea.
The archaeological record connects them to the Kulkin-Koban metallurgical province,
which was this highly sophisticated Bronze Age culture situated along the eastern Black Sea littoral.
Yes, and they are characterized by distinct burial kurgans, bronze metallurgy, and fortified settlements.
And, I think it's worth pausing on that metallurgical aspect for a second.
It's crucial. I mean, when we talk about the Kulkin-Koban province, we are not just talking about people making basic tools.
No, they had mastery over this.
Right. The mastery of bronze in a highly rugged, mountainous terrain provides a profound survival advantage.
Because it dictates agricultural efficiency and hard soil.
Exactly. And the quality of weaponry for defense and the ability to trade. The geography of the Caucasus Mountains creates deep valleys that act as incubators for isolated cultures.
So having a foundational technological advantage early on allows a specific group to anchor themselves to a territory permanently.
And that anchoring brings us to the linguistic side, which is a major factor in the source material.
Yeah, reading about the language feels like trying to decipher a completely different way of building a human thought.
The Abkhaz language is classified as a language isolate within the Northwest Caucasian family.
And it sits in this family alongside Abkhazian, Adyghe, and the Ubykh language.
Which is now extinct, unfortunately.
Right. The texts describe this language as having incredibly complex consonant clusters, ejective consonants, and a polysynthetic grammar.
Which is a detail that linguistic evidence heavily relies upon to demonstrate deep autochthonous or indigenous roots in the region.
Because to understand why, you have to look at the neighbors.
Right. Despite geographic proximity, there is a total lack of common ancestry between the Northwest Caucasian languages and the Kartvelian or South Caucasian languages.
And that Kartvelian group includes Georgian.
Exactly. They do not share a root language.
I'm trying to wrap my head around the polysynthetic aspect, though. From what the texts indicate, a single word can function as an entire sentence.
That's right.
It incorporates the subject, the object, and the verb through this dense system of prefixes and suffixes. It seems like it fundamentally alters how a person structures a thought.
It does.
You aren't stringing discrete concepts together in a line. You are building a single, highly dense conceptual block.
That is an accurate way to visualize it. In a polysynthetic language, relationships between the speaker, the action, and the environment are inextricably bound together in the very structure of the utterance.
You can't isolate it.
No, you cannot isolate a verb without acknowledging who is doing it and to whom. Some linguists suggest this reflects a societal structure where the individual is fundamentally inseparable from the collective and the immediate environment.
And when we look at how they identify themselves, the Abkhaz refer to themselves as Apsua, while the closely related Abkhazans call themselves Abkhazia.
And as we move forward chronologically into the early Greco-Roman textual evidence, we see variations of these names start to appear in the historical record.
Right, in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. Writers like Pliny the Elder and Flavius Arrian mention the Apsalae and Abkhazi tribes inhabiting this exact coastal and mountainous region.
And we see that continuity stretch into the 6th century CE with Procopius of Caesarea.
He details the Abkhazi as a mountain people living in heavily forested strongholds.
This textual thread from Apsua and Abasa to Apsalae and Abkhazi is frequently cited in the sources as primary evidence of their continuous indigenous presence on this specific stretch of the Black Sea coast.
But let me push back on this idea of them just sitting in their mountain strongholds undisturbed.
Go ahead.
The records show these ancient tribes became client states of the Roman Republic starting roughly in 63 BCE following Pompey's campaigns.
They did.
So if Rome is rolling through, how much autonomy are the Apsalae and Abkhazi actually retaining? I mean, it is hard to picture Rome just waving at them and leaving them alone.
It comes down to the sheer logistics of imperial expansion. The Roman control here was strictly nominal and indirect. You have to remember, Rome was a Mediterranean power focused on maritime logistics.
Right.
Their primary objective in the Caucasus was securing the coastal trade routes and maintaining a buffer zone against the northern nomadic incursions.
So they didn't want to go inland.
No, establishing direct administrative rule tax collectors, standing garrisons, Roman courts in the dense vertical terrain of the Caucasus Mountains was completely prohibitive in terms of cost and manpower.
They just needed the coast to be quiet.
Precisely. They operated the region through client kingdoms.
So the local leaders were largely left to govern their own internal affairs.
Yes, to manage their own populations and uphold their own laws. Provided, of course, they did not align militarily with Rome's enemies, like the Parthians or, later, the Sassanid Persians.
So this geographic and political isolation acts as a kind of cultural preserving fluid.
It really does.
Because they aren't being dragged into Roman courts or forced to adopt Roman civic structures, the Abkhazians preserved this highly distinct moral code and belief system.
Which brings us to a concept that the texts present as the absolute bedrock of their identity. Apsuara.
Right. Apsuara translates roughly to Abkhazianness.
But it is much more comprehensive than a simple ethnic identifier.
The sources describe it as an unwritten, deeply ingrained code of ethics, honor, and daily behavior that has been passed down through generations.
It dictates everything. How society functions, how guests are treated, how elders are respected.
And crucially, how conflict is resolved without a centralized state apparatus.
In this system, moral qualities are elevated to absolute, non-negotiable values.
There's a core pillar of Apsuara called alamus, which translates to conscience.
Yes, alamus is central.
There is a saying detailed in the texts. The death of an Abkhazian is in his own conscience.
That's a powerful statement.
I want to pause on that because the implication is intense. It means that someone who acts against their conscience, who violates this unwritten code of honor, is considered dead while still walking around.
It acts as an internal mechanism of social control.
Because there's no police force.
Exactly. When you do not have a police force, or a standing army, or a bureaucratic court system to enforce laws, the enforcement has to be internalized by every single member of the community.
So alamus is the internal judge and jury.
The fear of social death, of being ostracized and considered dead to your kin, is a far more powerful deterrent than a fine or a short prison sentence.
I picture this operating within the physical structures they built, because the texts detail that the traditional family structure was expansive.
Very expansive. Right up until the 20th century, it was common to find massive families, sometimes up to 30 people, living together in a single compound.
And they were governed by incredibly strict hierarchies of age and respect.
The elders were not just older relatives. They were the living, breathing archives of traditional culture and law.
The physical center of that expansive family life was the apatska.
This is a traditional wicker hut woven tightly from hazel branches.
Right, featuring a central, constantly burning hearth. Let's look at that space based on the sources. You step into the apatska, and it is not just a place to cook.
No, it's the focal point.
The open fire in the center is the focal point of all family life, and it doubles as the center of religious devotion.
Hanging directly over that fire is the hearth chain.
The texts mention that this chain was considered deeply sacred. Touching it during an oath was binding.
It illustrates how daily, mundane life, boiling water, weaving, eating, was completely intertwined with spiritual practice.
If a society has no stone temples, the hearth becomes the temple.
That's a good way to frame it.
Abkhazia functions like an invisible architecture. It is a structure that holds a society together, regulates behavior, and resolves disputes, even when external empires are collapsing or physical borders are shifting all around them.
And that invisible architecture was intrinsically linked to their native religion.
Which is described as a monotheistic, animistic system.
Right. At the very top, you have the supreme creator, Ansua.
However, the daily interaction with the divine occurred through numerous deities representing specific natural forces.
So you have Aphi, the god of thunder and weather,
And Ananagunda, the goddess of bees and marriage.
and Dislan, the goddess of water. The landscape itself is treated as an active, sacred participant in their lives.
The texts document the Biznia, the 7 shrines of Abkhazia.
These include prominent sites like Didripshnika and Ludzhanika.
What stands out to me here is how these shrines are managed. They are not maintained by a centralized priesthood or a church hierarchy.
No, they are maintained by specific hereditary priestly clans, like the Chichba and the Gocha.
So the religion is literally tied to the bloodlines of the people and the physical geography of the region.
You cannot export this religion.
Right, you can't just pack it up and practice it in a different country because the shrines are immovable mountains and groves.
And that geographic tethering becomes a significant factor of resilience. This internal cohesion, built on the dual foundations of Abswara and the native faith, faced intense pressure as the Abkhazians entered the medieval period.
Because the region became the frontier between the expanding Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire.
During the 6th century CE, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, the first initiated major Christianization efforts across the region.
But Justinian isn't just sending missionaries out of the goodness of his heart.
Of course not.
Establishing bishoprics is a geopolitical strategy. He is trying to align the region culturally and administratively with Orthodox Christianity to build a buffer against Persian influence.
Religion was statecraft, and this geopolitical rivalry erupted into the Lazic War, which dominated the region from 542 to 562.
During this conflict, the Abbaski found themselves squeezed.
Yes. In 550, they actually revolted against Byzantine rule, calculating that an alliance with the Persians might offer them better terms.
But that didn't work out.
No, the revolt was systematically suppressed by the Byzantine general Bessus.
But the Byzantines couldn't hold it purely by force indefinitely. Despite the suppression, the text suggests the Byzantine administrative influence inadvertently gave the Abkhazian leaders the blueprints to consolidate their own power structures.
They adopted the administrative framework of their imperial neighbors.
Right. By the 8th century, we see the emergence of a formalized Abkhazian kingdom under Leon I.
And the kingdom reached its absolute zenith under his successor, Leon II.
Who fundamentally shifted the geopolitical axis of the region. He moved the capital southward from Anacopia to Kutaisi.
The mechanics of how Leon II secured this independence are notable. He's dealing with the Byzantine Empire, which still views the region as its rightful sphere of influence.
So to counter that, Leon II looks north and strategically intermarries with the Khazars.
Which was a powerful Turkic nomadic empire.
Exactly. He is using Khazar military backing to tell the Byzantines to stay out.
Furthermore, he subordinates the local dioceses to the Georgian Orthodox Patriarchate of Mitsketa.
He is systematically dismantling Byzantine ecclesiastical control and replacing it with regional alliances. It is a masterclass in regional diplomacy.
Because by aligning ecclesiastically with Mitsketa, he strengthens ties with the neighboring Georgian principalities. And this alignment culminated in 1008. Through dynastic inheritance, the Abkhazian and Georgian thrones were formally united under the House of Bagration.
This creates a massive unified kingdom that becomes the major regional power.
But like most medieval power structures, it was eventually shattered by outside forces.
The Mongol invasions in the 13th century devastated the unified kingdom.
The central authority collapsed, and power decentralized rapidly back to the highland clans and local principalities.
Following that fragmentation, the region operated as a patchwork of semi-independent principalities for centuries.
This was the landscape when a new imperial power arrived in the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire.
The Ottomans established a major military foothold by building the Suhumkel fortress in the 1570s.
With the Ottomans comes a completely new religious and administrative pressure.
Over the next few centuries, Sunni Islam of the Hanafi school was gradually introduced into the region.
But the introduction of Islam was not a sudden, violent conversion.
Right, it was gradual.
It was implemented primarily through Ottoman merchants, military alliances, and administrative pressures aimed at the local elites.
And the sources note that the Hanafi school of jurisprudence is known for being relatively flexible regarding local customs.
Which allowed it to interface somewhat smoothly with the existing structures of diaspora.
But I keep thinking about the local leaders. How did the Abkhazian princes, specifically the Sharvashids dynasty, actually manage this?
It was difficult.
They are wedged in the mountains, they have the Ottoman navy on the coast, they have to pay tribute, but they also need to maintain their local authority over fiercely independent clans.
They executed a highly pragmatic balancing act, driven by the geography we discussed earlier.
Okay, how so?
The princes would pay tribute to Istanbul. This tribute was often paid in valuable resources, timber, horses, and tragically slaves, which fed the Ottoman markets.
Paying this tribute satisfied the Ottoman imperial administration.
But simultaneously, because the Ottoman galleys and heavy troops could not project power deep into the vertical forested terrain, the Sharvashids princes maintained de facto independence in their mountainous interior.
They bought the Ottomans off the coast and ruled the mountains themselves.
And the way the general population handled the religious shifts mirrors this pragmatism.
The texts indicate they engaged in what looks like dual or even triple conversion.
Over the centuries, they absorbed elements of Christianity from the Byzantines and Georgians. Then, they absorbed elements of Islam from the Ottomans.
But underneath it all, they kept their native religion, the belief in Ansua and the reverence for the 7 shrines, as their primary foundational spiritual anchor.
It was a deeply syncretic approach. An individual might observe certain Islamic fasting rituals, participate in a Christian feast day, and then take an oath on the hearth chain in the Abkhazia while invoking Ansua.
The external religions were often treated as diplomatic or cultural overlays,
while the native faith remained the operational core of their identity.
That centuries-long balancing act between empires ended abruptly in the 19th century, though.
Yes, it did.
The arrival of the Russian Empire forced a confrontation that altered the demographics of the region permanently.
Which brings us to the tragedy of muhajirism. The geopolitical tectonic plates shifted.
In 1810, Prince Aslan Bey of Abkhazia, facing internal rivals and external pressures, submitted to Russian authority.
This incorporated the principality into the Russian Empire. Russia's strategic goal was to curtail Ottoman influence on the eastern Black Sea coast.
However, signing a treaty in a palace didn't mean the Highland clans accepted Russian rule.
Not at all. It sparked decades of brutal resistance.
The Abkhazians became entangled in the broader Caucasian War, a massive, protracted conflict between the Russian Imperial Army and the indigenous Highlanders of the Caucasus.
This war did not end until the Highlanders were finally subjugated in 1864.
And once the military victory was secure, the Russian government immediately abolished the local princely authority entirely.
The Sharvashids dynasty was removed from power. Direct Russian military administration was imposed.
The administrative pressure on the local population rapidly became unbearable.
In 1866, the Lichny Uprising erupted.
When you examine the accounts of this uprising in the sources, it really comes down to a lethal combination of heavy taxation and profound misunderstandings.
The Russian administration attempted to implement land reform edicts.
But the Abkhaz peasants, who operated on complex traditional systems of land usage, did not understand the bureaucratic Russian decrees.
Rumors spread that the Russians were going to force the Abkhaz into serfdom-like obligations, essentially stripping them of their status as free communities.
The uprising was violent, but the Russian imperial response was overwhelming and systematic.
The suppression of the Lichny Uprising, compounded heavily by the geopolitical fallout of the subsequent Russo-Turkish War in 1877, triggered muhajirism.
Let's clearly define what muhajirism entails based on the text.
It was a massive forced displacement.
Between 1866 and 1878, tens of thousands of Muslim Abkhazians were forced into mass exile.
They were deported across the Black Sea to the Ottoman Empire.
We have to look at the logistical reality of this. We are talking about Russian troops moving into villages, forcing entire communities to the coast, and loading them onto Ottoman and private vessels.
The demographic impact was catastrophic.
In some coastal districts, the indigenous population dropped by 95% within a decade.
Stop and think about what a 95% population drop actually looks like on the ground.
The scale of that is difficult to process. It is an entire civilization being hollowed out. Villages are left empty. The hearth fires in the Abkhaz go out. The land goes silent.
By 1881, records indicate there were only an estimated 20,000 Abkhazians left in the entire Russian Empire.
Furthermore, the Russian state formalized their marginalization.
From 1877 to 1907, the remaining Abkhazians were officially designated by the Tsarist government as a guilty population.
This legal status restricted their rights, heavily taxed them, and crucially banned them from living in the coastal areas or near major towns.
They were forced into the higher, less productive mountainous zones.
The mechanics of this empire building are severe. What is the Russian Empire's ultimate objective here? Why expend the resources to empty a region?
It is absolute realpolitik. The primary objective of the Russian Empire was the strategic military security of the Black Sea littoral.
Right, because the Ottoman Empire was their primary rival.
They viewed the Muslim Abkhazians as a potential fifth column, a population that might align with the Ottomans in a future war.
The survival, culture, or land rights of the indigenous population were completely secondary to imperial security.
Once you empty the coast, you have to secure it. So the Russian imperial administration implemented a deliberate policy of demographic engineering.
They actively repopulated the vacated lands with Slavic colonists brought in from central Russia and Ukraine.
They encouraged Armenians fleeing the Ottoman Empire to settle there, and they facilitated the migration of Georgians from neighboring land-poor districts.
The explicit goal was to create a loyal, diverse, and preferably Christian ethnic base along a vulnerable frontier.
They were rewriting the demographic map of the region to serve imperial security needs.
And that demographic engineering permanently altered the region. The consequences of hollowing out the indigenous population and repopulating the coast carried directly into the 20th century.
It set the stage for the highly structured and often wildly fluctuating ethnic policies of the Soviet Union.
The transition from the Russian Empire to the Soviet Union brought a completely new ideological framework to the nationalities question.
Following the Bolshevik Revolution and the subsequent Civil War, Soviet power was established in the region.
In 1921, the Socialist Soviet Republic of Abkhazia was formed.
Initially, its status was quite high. It was established as a treaty republic, allied on equal terms with the Georgian SSR.
The leadership of this new Abkhaz republic was given to a prominent Abkhaz Bolshevik named Nestor Lokoba.
During this early 1920s period, the Soviet Union was implementing a broad policy known as Korenizatsiya, which translates to indigenization.
The logic behind Korenizatsiya was to diffuse the hostility that non-Russian minorities felt toward the former Russian Empire.
The Soviets wanted to prove they were not just a new version of Tsarist imperialism, so they actively promoted local cultures, languages, and leadership cadres.
Under this policy, the texts note the Abkhazians received intense preferential treatment.
Even though they were a demographic minority in their own territory due to the 19th century deportations.
The state designated them the titular nationality. The mechanics of this were incredibly advantageous for them in the short term.
Abkhazians were elevated to dominate local Communist Party posts and administrative roles.
In 1926, linguists developed a Latinized script for the Abkhaz language, replacing older alphabets.
The state funded the opening of Abkhaz language schools and the publication of local literature. It appeared to be an era of profound cultural revival.
But this early preferential treatment under Lokoba created a profound and ultimately false sense of security.
Because the Soviet bureaucratic machine was highly centralized.
Right. Policy could shift overnight based on the directives of a few men in Moscow.
And in 1931, that shift occurred. Under direct orders from Joseph Stalin, Abkhazia's political status was suddenly downgraded.
It went from being a treaty republic to an autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, or ASSR, strictly subordinated within the Georgian SSR.
It's a severe shift.
Why do they execute such a drastic reversal? What was the administrative logic behind that?
It reflects a fundamental shift in the Soviet nationalities policy, orchestrated by Joseph Stalin and Lavrentiy Beria, his chief of the secret police.
Both of whom were ethnic Georgians.
Yes. The central policy shifted away from encouraging fragmented minority ethnic identities toward rigid national consolidation and state control.
You can visualize this as a pyramid of assimilation. How does that pyramid actually function on a bureaucratic level based on the sources?
The state apparatus decides that managing hundreds of distinct micronationalities is inefficient and potentially rebellious.
Okay.
The goal at the bottom of the pyramid is for smaller minorities, like the Abkhaz, to assimilate into the larger titular republic nationalities, in this specific case, the Georgians.
And then the next tier.
The next tier of the pyramid envisions those republic nationalities eventually assimilating into a unified, homogeneous Soviet identity, which was heavily based on Russian culture and language.
The effects of this assimilation policy on the ground in Abkhazia from 1936 to 1953 were severe.
We are looking at a period characterized by intense, state-mandated Georgianization.
Let's look at the mechanics of erasure here. In 1938, the Abkhaz script, which had just been carefully Latinized a decade earlier, was forced into Georgian characters.
You are completely severing the younger generation's ability to read texts printed 10 years prior. It is an administrative strangulation of a culture.
Then, in the 1945 to 1946 academic year, the state systematically closed Abkhaz schools.
The primary language of instruction for all subjects was forcibly changed to Georgian.
If you want to participate in the economy, get a higher education, or interact with the state, you must abandon your native language.
Concurrently, the state sponsored massive economic resettlement programs.
They needed labor for the newly collectivized agriculture vast plantations of tea, tobacco, and citrus fruits.
To meet these quotas, the state moved thousands of Georgian peasants into Abkhazia.
This vastly accelerated the demographic shift that had begun in the 19th century.
By the 1989 census, Georgians constituted roughly 45% of the population in Abkhazia, while the Abkhaz population was down to 17.8%.
But the indigenous population was acutely aware of what was happening. They did not remain passive.
No, the texts note a significant protest in 1947.
3 prominent Abkhaz intellectuals figures like Georgy Zazaria, Bagrat Shinkuba, and Konstantin Shakril wrote a letter directly to Moscow.
They risked their lives to protest these policies, pointing out that the state was effectively dismantling the Abkhaz as a recognized nation.
It wasn't until the death of Stalin in 1953 and the subsequent execution of Beria that the state reversed some of these policies.
The post-Stalin thaw brought some relief. The Abkhaz language was transitioned away from Georgian characters and into a Cyrillic script.
Abkhaz schools were permitted to reopen.
However, the underlying structural issues, the massive demographic imbalance and the political subordination to Tbilisi, remain completely unresolved.
This simmering, unresolved tension culminated in 1978.
A massive petition organized by Abkhaz intellectuals demanded outright separation from the Georgian SSR and incorporation into the Russian SFSR.
This sparked significant street protests. Moscow responded with financial concessions and cultural investments, but refused to alter the political borders.
These fluctuating Soviet policies did far more than just move populations and change alphabets. They created an environment where history itself became a weaponized tool for survival.
Which brings us to the historiography, the memory wars.
When physical demographics are shifted so drastically, control over the historical narrative becomes the primary method of asserting territorial legitimacy.
And this is where we need to examine the conflicting historical narratives exactly as they are presented in the texts, without taking a side.
Let's analyze how both sides build their case, starting with the Georgian historiography, specifically the Ingorokva theory.
This theory was proposed in the 1950s by a Georgian literary scholar and historian named Pavle Ingorokva.
The core assertion of his theory is that modern Abkhazians are not indigenous to the region. He classifies them as an ethnos of Ade origin, whom he terms Absuas.
According to Ingorokva's timeline, these Abkhazians migrated down into the territory of modern Abkhazia from the North Caucasus relatively recently, in the 17th century.
Correct. Ingorokva argued that the real Abkhazians mentioned in ancient texts, the ones who built the medieval Abkhazian kingdom, were actually an indigenous Georgian population.
His theory posits that the incoming Adyghe tribes displaced or assimilated this Georgian population and simply appropriated the historical name Abkhaz for themselves.
The political utility of this theory is clear.
If the modern Abkhaz arrived in the 17th century, they are guests on Georgian land, which delegitimizes any modern claims to political autonomy.
Now, looking at the perspective provided by Mulkaz Toria, a doctor of history interviewed in Tbilisi, he provides a highly critical academic nuance to this.
Tori points out that within serious academic circles, the Ingorokva theory is considered radical and largely marginal.
He states it lacks sufficient, rigorous scientific evidence. He states that official Georgian historiography, represented by foundational scholars like Simon Janashia, has long recognized the Abkhazians as a distinct people with their own unique language.
The official measured Georgian academic view is that Abkhazians and Georgians have co-created a shared cultural, political, and geographic space for centuries.
But Toria also notes that despite being academically marginal, the Ingorokva theory became heavily popularized in the public sphere during the 1980s.
As the Soviet Union weakened and the national movement rose, this theory gained massive traction.
Toria suggests that, especially in the post-war era, subscribing to the Ingorokva theory serves as a psychological compensation for the collective trauma of military defeat and displacement.
Conversely, we must examine the Abkhaz nationalist narrative from the sources.
This narrative, heavily advanced by figures who became political leaders like Vladislav Ardzimba and Vyacheslav Chirikpa, takes the exact opposite approach.
It vehemently asserts ancient, uninterrupted indigenous roots in the territory, tracing a direct, unbroken line from the Colchian Bronze Age to the modern day.
In this narrative, the Georgians are viewed almost exclusively as late colonizers.
The Abkhaz narrative points to the Soviet resettlement programs of the 1930s and 40s as proof that the Georgian presence is a recent, artificial imperial imposition.
This narrative emphasizes that Abkhazia is an exclusively Abkhazian homeland, dismissing the centuries of mutual interaction.
Toria analyzes this clash of historical narratives using the concept of mirror nationalism.
Because if you strip away the specific names and dates, both sides, Georgian and Abkhaz, utilize identical mechanisms of historical justification. It is what he calls the absolutization of history.
What does that actually mean in practice, the absolutization of history?
It means taking a highly complex, multi-layered historical reality and flattening it out.
So ignoring the nuances.
Exactly. Events, migrations, and cultural exchanges are selectively emphasized or deliberately ignored to construct a rigid, linear narrative that claims exclusive ownership of a region from antiquity to the present day. It demands purity where only complexity exists.
But if historians are constructing these rigid narratives to serve state building, how does historical science even function objectively in these environments?
It's extremely difficult.
If investigating a migration pattern gets you labeled a radical by one side or a traitor by the other, history just becomes a branch of the Ministry of Defense.
That is precisely the danger Toria highlights. When theoretical approaches are mandated to reinforce predetermined political conclusions, the primary function of history, which is to provide a multifaceted explanation of complex human processes, is completely lost.
History becomes a zero-sum game.
And in the early 1990s, as the Soviet control apparatus vanished, these intense historical and demographic disputes spilled out of academic journals and into open, armed conflict.
The dissolution of the Soviet Union removed the overarching authority that kept these tensions frozen.
Let's look at the sequence of events leading into the 1992 to 1993 war.
Georgia declares independence under the nationalist leadership of Zviad Gamsakhurdia.
One of his government's moves is to abolish regional autonomies, signaling a return to a heavily centralized unitary state model.
The Abkhaz leadership views this as an existential threat.
Fearing complete political and cultural marginalization within a unitary Georgia, Abkhazia declares its own sovereignty.
They moved to restore their 1925 constitution, which granted it a treaty-based relationship with Georgia rather than subordination.
The geopolitical spark hits the powder keg on August 14, 1992.
The Georgian National Guard, operating under the authority of the post-coup state council led by Eduard Shevardnadze, crosses into Abkhazia.
The stated objective from Tbilisi was to protect crucial railway infrastructure from sabotage and to restore constitutional order in a rebel province.
The military reality on the ground escalated immediately, though.
Georgian forces rapidly occupied major districts, secured the capital Sukhumi, and pushed the Abkhaz forces back.
The Abkhaz forces were initially outgunned and disorganized.
They retreated to the northern stronghold of Gudara, and this is where the conflict widens significantly.
At Gudara, the Abkhaz leadership formed crucial alliances with the Confederation of Mountain Peoples of the Caucasus.
This umbrella organization brought in hundreds of battle-hardened Chechen and Cossack volunteers to fight alongside the Abkhaz.
Furthermore, the texts indicate that the Abkhaz received significant, albeit entirely unofficial and deniable, military support, intelligence, and heavy equipment from Russian military units stationed nearby.
The conflict metastasized into a brutal 13-month war.
It was characterized by the heavy use of artillery in civilian areas, protracted siege warfare, and brutal guerrilla tactics in the mountainous zones.
A major Abkhaz counteroffensive, bolstered by their North Caucasian allies and Russian equipment, eventually pushed the Georgian forces back.
This culminated in the fall of Sukhumi to Abkhaz forces on September 27, 1993, following weeks of intense, highly destructive street fighting.
We must look at the humanitarian toll of this war impartially, presenting the claims exactly as they appear in the texts.
The death toll estimates range from 10,000 to 15,000 people across both military and civilian populations.
The aftermath involved massive, catastrophic population displacement.
We must report the claims from Georgian sources, which are supported by extensive reports from Human Rights Watch and recognized by international bodies like the OSCE.
These accounts allege that Abkhaz-led forces and their allies engaged in systematic ethnic cleansing.
The reports detail targeted violence, executions, and terror tactics that resulted in the forced expulsion of up to 250,000 ethnic Georgians from Abkhazia.
Conversely, we must also report the Abkhaz accounts of the conflict.
Their narratives state that Georgian forces initiated scorched earth tactics, widespread looting of cultural institutions, and massacres of Abkhaz civilians immediately upon entering the territory in August 1992.
The Abkhaz narrative frames all their subsequent military actions as a legitimate war of self-defense against an unprovoked invasion aimed at their total ethnic subjugation.
The immediate aftermath of the war was a staggering humanitarian catastrophe.
The infrastructure of the region was devastated. Hundreds of thousands of refugees were living in temporary camps.
Geopolitically, the war created a frozen conflict.
It illustrates a broader pattern of how post-Soviet Russia utilized proxy separatist groups in regions like Abkhazia and South Ossetia.
By supporting these groups, Russia maintained powerful leverage in the South Caucasus, ensuring that a newly independent Georgia remained internally destabilized and unable to integrate fully into Western alliances.
So Abkhazia achieves de facto independence on the battlefield, but the geopolitical reality means they find themselves completely economically isolated.
They become heavily reliant on Russia for border security, pensions, and basic financial support.
That intense reliance creates a profound paradox.
They fought a war for independence, only to become wholly dependent on a massive patron state.
That reliance remains the primary source of tension in the region today.
And this tension brings us directly to the events of November 2024.
Decades of unresolved international status and the suffocating reliance on Russian capital culminated in a major political crisis within Abkhazia itself.
The catalyst for this specific crisis was an investment agreement.
On October 30, 2024, the Abkhazian Deputy Prime Minister and the Russian Minister of Economic Development signed a comprehensive economic pact.
This agreement granted massive, unprecedented tax exemptions to Russian investors for projects exceeding 2 billion rubles.
We are talking about temporary exemptions from property and profit taxes and a halved value-added tax rate.
The mechanics of this deal terrified the local opposition.
Leaders like Adgur Ardzinba looked at the text of the agreement and argued it was designed explicitly to enrich foreign Russian oligarchs without bringing any meaningful revenue to the local Abkhaz budget for up to a quarter of a century.
The opposition viewed this not just as a bad economic deal, but as an existential threat to their sovereignty.
They argued it was a betrayal of Abkhazian national interests, accusing President Islamization of attempting to usurp the region's limited natural resources and real estate for personal political gain.
In a small, economically fragile republic, massive foreign capital can easily buy political control.
The timeline of the crisis escalated rapidly.
On November 11, the Abkhaz parliament adopted a preliminary law regulating the multifunctional complexes linked to this Russian investment agreement.
That very evening, the State Security Service, the SGB, detained 5 prominent opposition activists who were returning from a public meeting.
The public reaction was instantaneous and highly organized.
Protesters immediately mobilized. They physically blocked the Kadori and Gumister bridges, cutting off the major arterial highways of the republic.
Clashes broke out with SGB officers. The rapid mobilization demonstrated how deeply unpopular the investment agreement was among the general populace.
The authorities attempted to de-escalate. They released the detained activists the next day, November 12, following negotiations.
But the anger had already crystallized around the agreement itself.
The climax of the crisis arrived on November 15. This was the day the parliament was scheduled to formally ratify the investment agreement.
Thousands of protesters gathered outside the parliamentary complex in Sukhumi.
When the leadership announced that the parliamentary session was canceled to avoid confrontation, it had the opposite effect.
The crowd surged, breaking down the perimeter fences and breaching the territory of the government complex.
The security forces attempted to hold the line, deploying tear gas and smoke bombs, but the sheer numbers overwhelmed them.
The protesters successfully stormed the parliament building, the main government buildings, and the presidential administration.
Having seized the physical centers of power, they demanded the immediate and unconditional resignation of President Priania.
A tense standoff ensued for 4 days.
The government was forced to relocate outside the capital to the village of Kamishi.
Finally, after protracted negotiations mediated by regional figures, Abkhazia officially signed his resignation.
Vice President Badra Gunba stepped in as acting president, constitutionally paving the way for snap elections.
I'm looking at the mechanics of this protest, and it raises a critical question about their geopolitical alignment based on the sources.
Right.
When protesters storm a parliament to stop a Russian investment deal, does this indicate a fundamental shift away from Russia? Are they trying to break the alliance?
Or is this strictly an internal domestic dispute over who gets to control the economic resources?
That distinction is paramount.
The opposition leaders were extremely careful to explicitly state publicly that the protests were not anti-Russian. They were not calling for a geopolitical realignment.
In fact, to emphasize this point, protesters were seen carrying Russian flags right alongside Abkhazian flags during the storming of the parliament.
So they're sending a message to Moscow. We are still your allies, we just reject this specific deal.
Exactly. This event highlights a delicate, deeply ingrained structural tension.
On one hand, Abkhazia has an absolute practical reliance on Russia for its diplomatic recognition, military security, and economic survival.
But on the other hand, there is a fierce, historically rooted internal desire to protect local sovereignty, land ownership, and economic resources from outside monopolization.
They are fighting to prevent their patron state from buying them out entirely.
It is the echo of that invisible architecture we discussed at the beginning.
It really is.
It is the internal mechanism reacting to a perceived existential threat to their autonomy, even when that threat comes with investment capital instead of an army.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to emphasize the point made in the texts about identity.
I want you to consider the sheer stubborn resilience of the Abkhazian identity.
When you look at the timeline we have unpacked today, this is a group of people who survived Byzantine cultural dominance.
They navigated Ottoman suzerainty.
They endured Russian imperial deportations that literally emptied 95% of their coastal population.
They survived decades of Soviet demographic engineering aimed at assimilating them out of existence.
And they survived a devastating modern war that destroyed their infrastructure.
The ongoing survival of the Abkhaz people challenges our fundamental understanding of how language, moral codes like apswara, and collective memory can actually outlast the rise and fall of massive empires.
It raises profound questions about the endurance of identity. It suggests that when an identity is tied so closely to a specific geography and enforced by a strict internal moral compass rather than external laws, it becomes incredibly difficult for external powers to fully erase it.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.